Is the mic working? Mic's working, okay, good. And if I could have the rest of the panelists come up. Normally I try to do an introduction, but after a couple of conversations with our distinguished guests, it became very evident that due to the intellectual horsepower, it's much better for you if I let them talk about what they do.
Thank you.
So, Becky, would you please start?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Realizing this is after lunch and just this panel and the next before you're almost at Friday, Labor Day weekend. So glad to be here. I am a recovering regulator like Loreena. I had been the commissioner and chairman of the Texas Public Utility Commission when we were in the throes of deregulating this power market here. So, what you heard Bill say really is kind of the legacy that we left, and he definitely makes us proud, especially during the course of the summer. Since then, I've had Klein Energy, my consulting company. I sit on utility and technology boards related to the power industry, and fill my time with a lot of other fun stuff as well. But I'm just really glad to be able to work in this industry with solar and other renewable companies and help them expand not only in Texas but across the United States.
Peter?
Thank you. Good afternoon as well. My name is Peter Grabick, and I'm here to offer some international perspective on this area. I work at the UTSA Small Business Development Center International Trade Center, and we essentially do three things. We help Texas companies in the Southwest region, which from El Paso, Austin, Corpus Christi, and basically everything south, get access to international markets. We help foreign entities. We facilitate foreign direct investment into Texas, and we also do some economic development work with USAID and the State Department, primarily in Latin America, a little bit in Africa. There was some stuff written into TPP for Southeast Asia, but that's been tabled for the moment. And we help open up small business development centers, kind of replicating the US model that's been around since the 1950s, and building trade development and trade capacity. In this industry specifically, I've been active over the last few years. 2 years ago in conferences like these, one of the things everyone was talking about was the tariffs. Are they going to happen? What are the implications going to be? The tariffs did happen. There was some constraint on the growth trajectory. And one of the things that I've been doing with companies throughout the region has been helping them access international markets as one of the potential new areas for growth.
Right.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Loreena Kiva. I am the former commissioner from the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, a state commission. I was very active as a commissioner, not only in the solar and renewables and storage area, but with international things as well, with the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. And you're coming wondering, like, what is the commissioner from Hawaii? Why is she part of a panel here in Texas? Well, it's because Hawaii has historically led since 2008 in the storage area. Our utilities were combining storage with renewables, and before it became popular to do that, and before the mandate in 2014 by California, we've led in terms of deployment of distributed energy resources, behind the meter customer resources. 1 in 3 households in Hawaii has rooftop PV, so we have the highest penetration per capita of rooftop solar in the country. We have the highest adoption of EVs in the country per capita. And again, for 2 years in a row, our little cooperative, rural cooperative, not the big investor-owned utility, Hawaiian Electric, KIUC has led and been the #1 utility in the country for 2 years running in terms of deployment of large-scale utility solar and storage for fully dispatchable peaker plants. So we have been leading and sending postcards from the future, as I always like to say, since 2008, and in 2000, here we are in 2019. So hope to share some of that practice and lessons learned and experiences now as my consulting as like a Becky. I'm a consultant. I am a senior policy advisor in energy policy and regulatory policy, and do work both internationally with USAID-sponsored programs through NARUC, as well as nationally representing clients and locally in my own backyard. So pleased to be here. Thank you so much, and look forward to the panel.
Yep. Yeah, thank you so much for making the time to come here today. And We could probably just open it up to questions now and finish out the 30 minutes, but we are going to talk a little bit, put a little structure around this. For most of our history, the evolution of the grid has been very measured and very managed. A lot of reasons for that, the capital intensity, the danger factor. But we're coming into a world with this, when we talk about hyper-innovation, where electrons are now mobile. They don't need a wire anymore to go and do what they need to do. You got people that can start up a power plant in their backyard or on their rooftop and plug it in, even if nobody knows. You've got where we used to set policy and everybody kind of worked under the policy. Now you're seeing major international corporations that don't necessarily disagree with the current administration's policy, step out on their own and say, you know what, we got the capital and the wherewithal to do this without the government now, and we're going to. So there's a lot of things in flux. I will ask Peter to start it off. He's got a very good international perspective, has been able to see a lot of things going on around the world lately, and brings a good business perspective. So what do the businesses want as we see this thing around solar and storage and clean energy and decarbonization evolve? So Peter, if you kind of pick up the comments from there.
Sure. Thank you, David. So internationally, the approach has largely been, from a regulatory standpoint, to set standards at a high level and then just expect all other actors within society to meet those standards. The United States at the federal level has been largely an outlier, and I'm sure that everyone is aware of pulling out of the Paris Accords, and we all watch the winds of politics as to how they address issues such as climate change and renewable energies. Where we have seen things happen is one, as David mentioned, a lot of the corporate world has begun to take these things seriously. They perhaps have longer time horizons that they're looking at in terms of asset and resource management, and so they have looked at renewables from that perspective. And from a regulatory perspective, I would say that if you're going to try and look at our situation and see it positively, there's long been this expression that you may have heard about the states being the laboratories for policy. And one of the things that we have seen is, although the winds have done what they have done on the national level, we have seen many states take different and innovative approaches on the regulatory side. The other big thing that we see, especially in renewable and solar, and many people in this room have been a party to that, have been considerable innovation and considerable reduction in prices, which is not necessarily regulation that does that. That's innovation. One of the big things in solar, which we've seen and been a party to, is China, for their own reasons, possibly their own security in terms of energy security. They greatly subsidized and overproduced on panels. One of the effects that you guys have probably seen on that is that your cost of goods sold margins have shrank, and now you're trying to get a viable business plan. And so the companies here that have been acting in this area had to innovate on all the other inputs. And so collectively you've seen, this is kind of the mechanisms that have led to a reduction of price within this industry. So that's kind of how I would overall see the framework. And the larger question, which some of my fellow panelists may be able to offer more insight on, is on the state, municipal, local levels, what does work? What are things that we maybe should be looking at in the future? What are the mechanisms by which we can engage things such as utilities, which are managed a certain way for specific reasons that David touched upon? And what insights can we bring to this community moving forward?
And thank you, Peter. Becky, last session we talked a little bit about the grand experiment of Senate Bill 7. I think it was started by Pat Wood and then probably dropped in your lap to execute on it. But if you think back that was, at least for me, the largest policy almost experiment that I've seen. Can you maybe just take us down to maybe a little bit of a trip down memory lane around how that policy evolved and changed, and maybe what you felt like we got right about it to begin with, and maybe things that from a policy perspective we could have done differently?
Sure, and I won't belabor the memory lane for too long, but I think there were a couple of milestone things that helped build the foundation for deregulation. And Mike Sloan, thank you very much. I didn't realize it was like just 3 days away from the 20th anniversary. It's amazing how time flies. But One of the things was in '95 having wholesale competition in the power industry, and that was across the board, and so nationally, but in Texas too. So that was important. But I think in the late 90s, it was the mindset of the leadership in our government in Texas as well that was really locked into looking at changing the compact and seeing how a market-driven industry can flourish. And we had seen the airline industry go through that and the trains, and so there was a pattern there. And we weren't the first movers, right, in as far as the industry sector in looking at that. But then we weren't, as Texans, the first movers in the United States either. And I think that has been something that has been very critical for our success. And we watched California and went to California to learn from them. We traveled to Pennsylvania and we learned from them as they deregulated. We went to the UK and learned about their deregulation. We got a lot of input from Australia. So we weren't the avant-garde innovators, but what we did do is have that support and knowledge from all those entities to make and build what we needed for our independent ERCOT grid. And that's the mindset that we've continued even when we came in with locational marginal pricing a few years after that. A lot of people said, why don't we do it the cheap way and just grab what PJM is doing and bring it down here? But no, we wanted to do it our way and tailor make it. And so it's worked for us. And as you heard Bill Magna say, it's like, no, we got this covered. And so fortunately, we've had a very resilient and successful 20-year streak of a market-driven economy that has brought in a lot of technology and has brought you guys to the table, which we appreciate very much. And so the job is hard for you, I know, to sometimes make your innovative technologies kind of fit the paradigm, but we sure have seen some of that, and we really appreciate both not just wind, but also solar being so committed to our market over the last 10 years to just keep on and keep on and keep on trying to figure out what that niche is to make it work. And so hopefully that will continue for the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Becky. And then there was Hawaii. I can remember looking at the first set of numbers about solar penetration and going, well, I can't say that. But anyway, going, what is going on in Hawaii? So, Loreena, if you would, again, I'm trying to set some context here.
Right, sure. Let me give you some context in terms of where we sit as regulators. I mean, kind of like Texas with the Texas PUC. We're not FERC jurisdictional. So the Hawaii PUC, of course, there's no interconnection between the 6 islands that form our main, islands in our state. Each island is its own grid, its own energy ecosystem. No interconnection between islands, and obviously no big, extension cord to the West Coast. So we don't have any FERC jurisdiction. Technically, we don't have any NERC jurisdiction or RTO or ISO jurisdiction. The Hawaii PUC is everything. Although we adopt NERC standards and we adopt other national standards, we are the regulator that gets to decide everything. So we don't have to worry about being in somebody else's swim lane or whose jurisdiction is this. So that has been the ability for us to tackle issues very holistically and real time. And I think, as Peter said, I think the states and the cities have been the living laboratories, and definitely island grids like ours that were at ground zero for the effects of climate change as well, have been the living laboratories for decarbonization policies. And so Hawaii was the first state in the U.S. to adopt 100% renewable portfolio standard, even though, again, California gets all the hoopla. But we did that back in 2008 with the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, which was a 70%, and then a few years later, 100% by 2045. So we've been shorter timetable. And now 100% decarbonization, so reduction of greenhouse gas emissions for carbon neutral and carbon free in all other sectors. So that has led to, a natural kind of, even a market response, like you say. The market responds. When you have a kind of an external driver like that, the market responds, and sometimes the utilities can get overwhelmed by that. So while we had robust growth, I think part of that was it got out a little ahead of the utilities with net energy metering. We had a robust net energy metering phase, but then also we had to cap that and move on to new tariffs to continue to make sure that solar distributed energy resources as well as solar and storage could be viable and continue to be sustainable in our state. So we have new tariffs for that, which kind of align to what some of the speakers that preceded this panel talked about, to incent using customer-sided resources, behind-the-meter resources to provide actual now not only just energy, but capacity to the grid and ancillary services to the grid, like voltage regulation, frequency regulation, regulating reserves. You never thought that storage and renewables could do that, but now with the new technology and innovation, we can. And so regulators have to be able to respond to that in real time and make course correction where needed.
Thank you, Lorraine. And so hopefully we're kind of, let's call it up to the present, right? This is how we got to where we're at now. A lot of commercial entities in the room, and generally the question is, how do we make this boat go faster? So, what are the potential, policies, innovations around policy that can help accelerate the deployment of solar and storage and make everything better for everyone? So I'm going to just kind of, as an open question to the panel, Becky, I ask you to start off, but what have you seen in sort of all your travels that is new and innovative from a policy perspective that helps this innovation flourish?
A couple of things I've seen. One is a financial transaction called securitization. And securitization, it used to be purely used, 20 to 25 years ago for stranded cost recovery when states were looking at deregulating. And now it's being used for all kinds of different things, natural disaster recovery. But, for example, New Mexico, are any of y'all doing business in New Mexico? Show of hands? No? Anyway, okay. There is someone. Well, New Mexico just passed a law to use securitization for major infrastructure investment in renewables and also coal decommissioning. So you're starting to see that. I think Wisconsin has one for renewables as well. So that kind of financial model is now being used in the context of our contemporary world of finding feasible cash flows at low cost for high investment allocations like a renewable rollout to meet these 2040, 2050 renewable standards that we see. So that's one, securitization. Number two is nothing that I've actually seen quite yet, although Lorraine will talk about one rate-making alternative, but just the fact that our state commissions and are looking at and really starting to become more open to alternative rate-making methods. So we just saw recently last week in North Carolina, the legislature was passing for Duke a multi-year rate-making process. So like a 5-year rates that they could put into place. But at the last minute, they put the skids on with an amendment and said, wait, we want to make sure that the commission looks at alternative rate-making processes before we actually cement this. So, some of the discussion has to do with things like subscription-based rates, just like the rest of the economy that surrounds us, Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime, or subscriptions. So, why isn't the power industry looking at that too? And I think there's starting to be some meaningful chatter in that. So it's going to be exciting to see what the future holds.
Lorraine?
Do you want me to segue in that? Okay, real quick then. What Becky was alluding to is in some jurisdictions like ours, you're hearing the new term performance-based regulation. We're no longer looking at rate cases based on, just sales of kilowatt hours and return on investment, return on equity, but we're trying to look at outcomes, performance outcomes and measures, and to allow utilities to stay out, and because a rate case is a very expensive process. I mean, only the lawyers really make money on that process. It's time-consuming for the commissions, time-consuming for all the stakeholders, the interveners, and for the utilities. So to the extent we can allow utilities to recover cost for achieving outcomes such as clean energy or having new revenue opportunities by maybe partnering with stakeholders in putting in new EV charger systems, putting in batteries behind the meter, allowing customers to do more innovative things and involving customers in supporting the grid and providing energy and capacity to the grid. This PBR framework allows that because you're looking more at outcomes, you're looking at metrics, and the utility being rewarded, and in some cases, in our jurisdiction, when they can save money, to be able to share in that revenue savings and to be able to deploy money on things that are needed, like grid modernization to enable more renewables. And on the other side, where you actually, devil's in the details, right? We talk about these great platitudes and these great policies that states and municipalities want to do, but when it comes down to actually implementing, and we have to get down to brass tacks, it's really being able to have regulation that quickly addresses changing technology requirements. Like the earlier panels address very technical things like IEEE 1547 standards that now allow usage of the reactive power in the smart inverters, or allow smart solar to happen, or allow the power control systems in batteries to be harnessed. Well, if the regulations don't keep up with that, if we don't have tariffs that allow for customers to get credit for putting these things on their own facilities, or utilities to cost recover for technology investments that are software technology, it's not going to happen. So regulation is going to become a barrier, not a facilitator. So many tariffs have to be responsive to that. And so in Hawaii, we have the Rule 14H tariff, which before was leading, and now because of the new IEEE 1547 standard, now lags a little bit behind Rule 21 in California, but we're catching up to make sure all that syncs up. So the people like yourselves who are, the folks actually installing and making these facilities happen can have smooth interconnection process. We also have to send the right price signals so the market can respond and then get out of the way. Microgrids are a big new area that we don't have specific direction on. So, what value does a microgrid bring? And we had some speakers earlier today that talked about that. But really, what's the value, and how do you value that so that the utility knows how to purchase those microgrid services and also reward customers for investing in putting in solar and storage, or putting other assets into the grid and a microgrid to be controlled by the utility for resilience purposes, for reliability purposes, for other reasons that are of value to the community at whole. So these are very granular things that regulators must take a look at, but that's where the rubber meets the road. Got to get it done, got to implement. We can have the legislative framework, we can have the societal goal, but proof's in the doing, and as Becky knows from having to implement the deregulation, it usually falls to the regulators to actually implement and be in the trenches with the men and women like yourselves who are actually implementing and getting it done.
So I would look at market activities and see where they touch upon regulatory areas where either a framework or signaling may be helpful in either promoting or making it easier for all of you to expand activity in this area. I think finance is a big one. Becky spoke about securitization. These types of installations usually have a really long payback period. We're usually talking 20 years or longer. And we've worked with things like the ITC credit. We've discussed within this event, we've discussed opportunity zones and the role that they might play. We've discussed situations where perhaps an installation can add value to a property, but that value might be abated from a tax perspective. So I think that there's a lot of areas you can look at in addressing that long repayment period where regulation can either send signals, provide a framework, or help facilitate the ease of those types of financial transactions. Another area is, of course, with interaction with utilities, which that's a dialogue, and I think that's something that generally we've been addressing within this conference. I don't know if I have a lot of specific insight to add on that area. A third area, and I don't know if this has necessarily a regulatory framework, but that would be the marketing side of it. I know that a lot of you are kind of marketing on the ground in your roles as entrepreneurs with your businesses. I know that there's some lead generation that comes. There may only be a few sources. Maybe there should be more activity to try to promulgate, more varied sources. This may be more market mechanisms than regulatory mechanisms. But, perhaps messaging broadly for the industry, we've all discussed that that's an issue. So I don't know if there's necessarily regulatory responses to that, but perhaps collectively as a community, there are ways to express that through channels where regulation does play a role.
Thank you, Peter. I think everybody here has probably heard Carl Popham's story about the descent of the scooter on the unsuspecting citizens of Austin. Basically the companies were not happy with the way policy was proceeding or their, I guess, lack of any progress. So they just put 250 out one night and turned the app on. That could have some devastating consequences if you did something like that to the electricity grid, right? Somebody just stuck a bunch of new stuff on it and turned it on and Bill's phone blows up. But, how can you maybe float some ideas around mechanisms for ensuring that policy gets faster and more flexible and has maybe the ability to at least keep up, if not get in front of the pace at which technology is moving these days?
Sure. That scooter analogy that you just gave, David, is applicable to those of you in this room that are solar developers and all of your brethren across the nation that are solar developers, because although it's in a more time-delayed sequence within the renewable penetration world, you're making a huge impact on utilities. For example, just reading the other day how Jacksonville Energy Administration in Florida finally said, okay, I give, and is putting themselves up for sale. Why? Because they realize the future of their jurisdiction is going to be full of self-sufficient homes. And, the mantra of lower revenue streams. So, they did their homework just like all the other utilities have in the nation about, okay, well, let's become something that's not regulated. Let's become an HVAC provider. Let's become a 5G fiber telecom provider. But many of those, like JEA, had barriers. They had to get new charters or new permitting or something that was going to have to be really not in the realm of probabilities for them. So, they are looking for an acquirer. In the Pacific Northwest, we see a coalition of utilities starting to come together to start figuring out amongst themselves what are alternative rate-making models that, the seven of us could agree on and bring to the regulator. I mean, wow, what a concept. So, but if it weren't for this wave, we definitely wouldn't have seen that pivot that we're starting to see now. So, I think that you sit here thinking, and I feel questions like, well, how can I have a voice in ERCOT? It's like, well, you are making an impact. You may be not doing it directly, and it just takes time, but it is definitely being felt.
I think, and being now as a former regulator, I think probably can speak more candidly, but I think, disruption is not necessarily a bad thing. Change is inevitable, and when you have change agents coming in to create external drivers, hopefully you have, smart-minded men and women in utilities that get it, and they realize, back in 2014, the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, we were actually recognized because we issued a white paper that talked about the inclinations on Hawaii's utilities of the future, and we set forth a strategic roadmap that basically told the utilities, plan ahead, incorporate some of these disruptive technologies, and listen to your customers, because ultimately, at the end of the day, you need to meet customers, and you have a new generation of customers that tend to be much more prosumer, enabled, empowered, and disruptors can go direct to your customers now. So if you're not providing the services, you're not being responsive, people will definitely, make choices. In a jurisdiction like Texas, it's a retail choice. You can walk with your feet. In Hawaii, we have an investor-owned monopoly, and we have one rural cooperative. Maybe they don't walk with their feet, but they walk with being able to sign up more folks in the DER space and more rooftop PV, more self-supply, and the utility then begins to, if they're not decoupled, their revenue base begins to shrink. So I think we've encouraged them in a collaborative way to work with the DER community, work with the solar and storage developers to find a good portfolio mix. There's enough in there that everybody can benefit. Large-scale utilities, solar and storage has its benefits. Behind the meter, distributed energy resources, where some of the folks in the room today represent that sector of the industry. Everybody has a place to play, and so there's enough that can be done, enough yet to be done, that I think a collaborative approach is important, and not necessarily as an us and them. That does take some coordination and some education, and I'm hoping that the more progressive utilities and the more progressive regulators step up and help to facilitate that dialogue, so it's not chaos, and that I think the regulators have a push point for, at least for investor-owned utilities, that have to do integrated resource planning. They have to plan. They have to put their plans in front of the PUCs for approval. There's a little bit more of an orderly transition, so you don't get caught by surprise. But even when you do have that situation, the amount of, who was it, the gentleman that started our talk today, our session today, 500% estimating the amount of adoption of solar. I mean, talk about EIA being off. I mean, 500% off is a big number to be off by, so you can't be caught by surprise, and you have to prepare, and it's not, it can be a win-win. Embracing new technology, embracing new tools that help the utility to be more efficient and cost-effective makes the regulator happy. Happy customers, it's like, we talk about the virtuous circle in regulatory parlance. Happy customers, make for happy regulators, make for happy shareholders or members of the utility. So it works.
Becky, you want to?
I'll just add a quick coda, because it's one thing for us to be able to address the issue of innovation and policy related to DER, but the other aspect, which is a corollary of DER, is in America today, our demographics are shifting so much, and that is that we need to remember our low and middle income consumer base, and that fact that we are having such a wonderful new movement in ubiquity and renewables and clean energy, we need to remember how they can be a part of that. And so, I have a big heart for the nexus of energy and poverty, and I think that, that is really a challenge that I will not only put in front of regulators and policymakers, but also for each of you, to try to remember that it's not just commercial, industrial customers and those residential customers can afford your rebates, but it's the broad mass of low and middle income customers as well. And I know that there's one company in the room that is already addressing that problem here in San Antonio and soon in other places, and you'll be hearing from them in the next panel.
And just a quick point, I think that this example outlines a general tension in the development of any market subject to a regulatory framework. A vacuum is sometimes where the innovation happens, right? So you need the space in order to take risks, make decisions, evolve the market from an innovation standpoint. However, if that vacuum is, if the framework is too broad, you're left with uncertainty. Which introduces risk and which constrains decision-making from that perspective, where you don't act because you have this kind of paralysis, because you don't know what the snapback might be if you decide to drop these bikes in the middle of downtown, and some people might consider them a public nuisance. So I think that the art of addressing policy and innovation in development of a market like this is about finding the right balance within those two constraints between having room for innovation and having too much uncertainty for actors to act within the market.
And we've got a time for a couple of questions. Anybody? You have two ex-regulators on stage that can talk candidly and you don't have any questions? Okay.
These aren't their utility guys, that's why. These are
Oh, we got one.
the industry people.
Hi, Andy Iden from Portland General, so one of the Pacific Northwest utilities. Trying to figure out how does the utility not lose out with behind-the-meter solar or demand response or whatever other DER might eat into a traditional revenue base. So could you just speak, when you mentioned that, Becky, what your take on the conversation is, or maybe from Hawaii's perspective?
Sure.
What do you think I should try to get regulators to do, and how do I start that conversation as someone in the utility that sees how conversations can quickly derail if you don't kind of put the proper boundaries on them?
I think one thing is going in force. So not just your company, but seek out your brethren as well to go together. So you're not just out there solo. And I know that the climate from year to year for commission as the commissioner profiles change, you don't know what you're in for, right? Because there is certainly, regulatory risk is certainly alive and well. So I would suggest that. But also, if I could be so bold as suggest, today there is AI and ML and predictive analytics that will certainly help you in your fully regulated area to help you see and be more transparent as to what's happening along your jurisdiction. And the thing is, it'll help if you have AMI, and I don't know how ubiquitous that is in your particular footprint, but that in and of itself will carry you a long way.
I'm going to respond real quickly. Portland General Electric is actually one of the progressive utilities, and I'll give you a shout out for that. Maria Pope, your CEO, female CEO, one of the leading CEOs on the West Coast. You've done a lot in terms of resiliency and a lot in terms of preparedness for one of the major things they're preparing for. Talk about being prepared is the Cascadia earthquake, which is expected to happen in along that coastline. So a shout out to you. But I think in terms of how do you respond to behind the meter, potential disruption is really educating customers, educating stakeholders. What's the value of the services they get from the grid? And I think most regulators would support that unbundling those services, just so there's maybe a value of solar and a value of energy. And at different places on the grid, the value of energy being delivered to the grid might be different. We talked about that yesterday in some of the sessions. But likewise, the grid services that people take, that no matter what, even in a high penetration place like Hawaii, we're never off the grid. You still need the grid. The sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day. For certain loads, you need to have the grid there to maintain certain, obviously needs within a home or a facility. So it's educating customers to the value of the grid services they take, and it's unbundling those services because people don't see that on their bill. So when they do see the value of that, they can better understand what the rates are. They can better understand how they can participate in demand response programs, and that they will get credit for staying connected to the grid, for allowing their loads to be controlled, for even putting stuff on their homes or their buildings at their own expense that can help support the grid, which is what a lot of demand response aggregators are doing, working with the utility. A good example of that, Green Mountain Power in Vermont, that allows their customers to buy a battery for behind the meter, helps them choose that, so long as they allow the utility to be able to control that asset and resource. Now, that's a good partnership. And I wouldn't think that Vermont's a real high solar area. It's not Arizona, New Mexico, Hawaii, or California by any means, but it seems to be working for them, and it's part of building that customer relationship, which I think PG&E is very good at, actually. So you're way ahead compared to some other utilities. I think you're in good stead.
Okay, I'd like to join me in giving the panelists a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.